Fowler is the professor of Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe at Stetson University in Florida. She's also the director of Stetson program in Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies. She's the author of an amazing book, which we were supposed to discuss today, titled Beaumont on Empire's Edge, State and Stage in Soviet Ukraine. She's a former actress, an amazing historian, and a very dear friend of mine. We met 7 years ago, or something around that, in Lviv, Ukraine, at the Center for Urban History, where Professor Fowler is a researcher. Since then, we met many more times in United States and in Ukraine, have many common Ukrainian friends, and we both care very deeply for this country, its history, culture. And today, Professor Fowler agreed to talk with us about her Ukraine, about things that she holds dear to her, about some of her friends, many of whom are very restless, and the title of one of the class that is joining us is Restless Women. So there will be hopefully some restless women in this presentation. So maybe without further ado, please help me welcome Professor Fowler.
Thank you. Thank you, Anu, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you for having me in your class, and thank you to all of you students. There's so many of you online and in the classroom, and I'm so grateful that you're here to listen to me talk about Ukraine. Let me share my screen. I've made a nice PowerPoint for us to look at. Hang on. Let's see. Okay, great. So let me just begin. Ukraine has been a part of my life since 2005, when I wrote a paper in graduate school at Princeton on Ukrainian theater. And since then, that's 17 years ago, I've spent years researching in Ukraine. Most recently, I was on a Fulbright in 2019-2020. I've seen hundreds of theater productions. I've even fallen asleep during some of them. I've read thousands of archival documents, and I've spent countless hours grappling with the Ukrainian language. But that is not what makes my heart stop when I see the Russian army bombing Ukraine. It is my friends. 17 years is a long time to know people. That's most of my adult life. And in recent days, I've been able to Skype with a very good friend of mine, Sophia Diak, a restless woman, if there ever was one. She's in Lviv. Like me, like Dr. Muller, she's an academic, but instead of teaching, she runs a research center. And she's turned that center into a shelter. Recently, I heard from her, they're currently sheltering 50 refugees. She's organizing ways of helping Ukrainian scholars. She's working on ways of recording what is happening in Lviv, and not only, right? Trying to get testimony of war, testimony that students many years from now will read in classes just like yours. One of the projects that we're working on that she really wants to work on is how do we change public opinion on Ukraine? Clearly, people know the country exists now. They do. You know Ukraine exists. But people only know what they see on the news, right? You've seen the images. You've seen the bombed out squares. You've seen the tanks. You've seen people interviewed on CNN on absolutely the worst day of their lives, right? But that is not the country that she wishes you to know about, right? She wishes you to know about this beautiful Ukraine that is her country. And so what I kind of wanted to do was share a little bit of that country with you, right? And I'll be honest, I did a webinar for my own campus, Stetson University, yesterday, and I talked a little bit about Ukraine, and we had some of my colleagues talking about some of the politics in Russia right now, and issues of sanctions, issues of sort of international law, and et cetera, et cetera. And I had all my students write response papers, right? You've attended this webinar, write me a response paper and get extra credit. And interestingly, what the students picked up on was the Russia story and how, wow, you know, we're seeing Ukraine in the news, but it's hard for Russians too. And, you know, we really need to think about Russians. And it's true, it is hard for Russians right now, absolutely, right? Protesters are arrested, Putin's made it very difficult to protest. Certainly the ruble is in free fall, absolutely, it's so hard. And Putin is not Russia, we know this. But it was really striking to me how easy it is to forget Ukraine. And that actually for students who were sort of new to this region, what they picked up on was the Russia story and not the Ukraine story, the country that's being bombed, the democratic, utterly normal country that was brutally invaded. And so part of the larger argument of what I want to tell you today and of the images that I'm showing you and of this PowerPoint, the larger argument is for you to look at Ukraine and for you to think of Ukraine and for you to think of why is it, and I'm sure you all have this, you've all thought about this in your own lives. Why do some countries seem to matter and some countries don't, right? Why in discourse do we talk a lot about the US and Russia, right? Or Europe or Germany, but not about other countries? There's a hierarchy of countries, and why is that? Why do some countries matter and some countries don't? So without further ado, let me share with you some pre-war Ukraine. Ukraine as I know it, as I knew it. There's going to be a lot of images. Some of them will wash right over you, and that's fine, right? It's early in the morning your time, so just enjoy this story of my Ukraine. So this is the view from my very first apartment in Kyiv in 2006. The view looks out over Maidan Nezalezhnosti, Independence Square, the central square in Kyiv, where revolution had happened in 2004 and where it would happen again in 2013, 2014. This is a meal at Puzata Chata, or Chubby Hut, which is a sort of fast food style, buffet style Ukrainian restaurant. It's a chain, they're all over, it's delicious. This is my classic meal here. You see the cucumber and tomato salad. You see sirniki, which are fried cheese, delicious things with jam and sour cream. And you see, of course, the ubiquitous borscht or beet soup, bread, and sparkling water. Since then, I've met countless friends at Chubby Hut and had countless meals. Ukraine means the beach at Odessa. And the beautiful 11th century cathedral, St. Sophia's, Sofisky Sobor in Kyiv. That's actually where the art archives are, the archives of literature and art pictured right here. So I've spent a lot of time at Sofisky Sobor. And Sofisky Sobor is, again, it's 11th century cathedral in Kyiv, and it's something that people are talking a lot about. Should the Russians bomb Kyiv, right? This is something that could be lost. Here I am with theater friends in winter at St. Sophia's before we went back to Nadia's apartment, and they taught me how to make kutya, which is a rich New Year's dish that one makes for good luck. Both are scholars and activists. Both are currently still remaining in Kyiv. Both taught me about theater, including the Brazil Theater, run by theater innovator Les Kurbas. That's what my book was about, that when Dr. Muller and I planned this event back in the day before the invasion started, we were gonna have you read some of the book and we were gonna talk about my book and it was gonna be great. But now you're just getting more of a general story of Ukraine. This is from 2009. Nadia and Ira and I went to the theater's archives to do research in Kharkiv. So Kharkiv, you've seen images of that big government building on the square that's been bombed. You've seen some of those scenes of urban devastation. This was actually the capital of Soviet Ukraine from 1918 to 1934. It was a beautiful modernist constructivist city with amazing culture about which I wrote a book. I got to see Les Kurbas's hometown in Galicia on a hill in Western Ukraine. And here I am in 2017, celebrating the publication of my book on a Kiev rooftop at a jazzy book party. But other friends have also helped me understand Ukraine. Here is another restless woman, Oresia Kulik, from the Ukrainian diaspora, now a professor in Manitoba. And here we are in Chernihiv. Chernihiv is an old Ukrainian city with a lot of churches. I believe this one is also from the 11th century. Chernihiv has been just devastated by Russian bombing, right? And so this is a sort of a before picture to match with the after pictures that we've seen in the news. Nothing's more Ukrainian than a summer music festival. And here I am at Kraina Mri, Land of Dreams, with my two friends, Natalia and Yosef. Yosef is American, Ukrainian diaspora. You can see he has a camera on. He actually is a professional photographer and has done a lot of photography for the New York Times, among other news outlets. Here I am, Natalia's teaching me to make borscht. And here I am a few years later with Natalia's daughter. She and her now two kids just crossed the border into Romania and got a flight from Bucharest to join Yosef back in the United States. Kiev is beautiful. This is from the rooftop of a theater. I seem to spend a lot of time in theaters and a lot of time on rooftops in Ukraine. This is a mural in Kyiv after the war started in 2014. Yes, the war started in Ukraine in 2014. In the West, we've sort of woken up to it now, but actually Ukraine has been at war since 2014. Ukraine is also Lviv, a beautiful city in Western Ukraine that used to be part of Poland and the Habsburg Empire. This is the university in Lviv, formerly the Habsburg Parliament, where I was affiliated on my Fulbright. This is Ira's birthday party in Lviv. Here are my students I taught on my Fulbright at the theater department. Many of them are now refugees in Prague at the Theater Institute there. Here are the students I taught at a summer school of Jewish culture. Ukraine is also Jews and Jewish culture. This is a public history project at the Golden Rose Synagogue, or the site of the Golden Rose Synagogue, the Zolota Rosa, which was destroyed by Nazis and their collaborators in the Holocaust, and it's now a site of contemplation. You can see these stones here. They're in the shape of matzevas, headstones, and on each stone is a quote from a Jewish person from this city, right, from sort of several centuries ago until recently, and it's a beautiful site of contemplation. And really a way for contemporary Ukraine to figure out how to weave that lost Jewish past into a really diverse and civic Ukrainian present. But Ukraine is also Muslims. Here's a mosque, actually on the Ukrainian side of what Ukrainians call the ABL, the administrative border line with Crimea. Okay, so Crimean Tatars, the indigenous people of Crimea, crossed the ABL to come worship here at this mosque, right? Because there's very little freedom of religion in Russia, and Crimea is now part of Russia. But Ukraine is also avant-garde theater performances. This is Diki Teatr Wild Theater in an outdoor immersive production that took place in the Kiev Zoo. Ukraine is also hipster art exhibits. Ukraine is also hipster coffee shops. Ukraine is also social justice projects. This is from a theater project called Class Act, which was created to help kids who were suffering from the war in the East. So it brought together students who had been displaced because of war in the East, working with kids from Western Ukraine. And together they were brought together by theater professionals to write plays and then stage the plays. And so this is sort of the big end of the project theater production, where very well-known actors in Kiev acted and performed these plays written by young writers, by children. It's a beautiful, beautiful project. Ukraine is also the Dnipro River. You've probably seen that on the news too, the river that winds and divides Ukraine into right and left. Ukraine is also Zaporizhia. right? You've seen Zaporizhia a lot on the news because of that nuclear power plant that was there, right? And there was concern about Russians shooting the nuclear power plant. Is it still safe? Well, it's a beautiful city with a long history. This is actually a site of what used to be the tallest Lenin in the Soviet Union. Cities sort of competed with the size of their Lenins. This was the tallest one. And after 2014, in what's called Leninopad or Lenin Fall, when people tore down all these Lenin statues, no one really knew what to do with Zaporizhia's Lenin. And you can see they've sort of covered it over with a picture of a Cossack, but they're still trying to figure out what to do with this square and with this formerly tallest Lenin. This is also Zaporizhia. Dr. Muller mentioned how she and I met in Lviv. Well, we met at a summer school. There was an international summer school of the social sciences run partially by a Ukrainian diaspora organization, the Danila Foundation, also by the French embassy, bringing together an amazing group of scholars and students. And we got to have these summer schools in different cities in Ukraine. And what's been really amazing for me is watching these cities on the news. And we've been there. We've been to those universities, met those students, walked those city streets. And so what you see on the news is one image, but I remember the university and the intellectual life and the beautiful food and the beautiful walking tour. Here we are in Zaporizhia on the river. Here we are in Zaporizhia on the left, eating after our river swimming. And on the right in Kharkiv, this is a picture from the State University in Kharkiv, which has been bombed. And actually, I don't know what the condition is it is in, but my colleagues who work there say that it is destroyed, that their offices are destroyed, their classrooms are destroyed. This beautiful university that's been around since the 19th century is no more because of Russian bombs. This is also Zaporizhia. Interestingly, Zaporizhia had this sort of moment of modernist architecture. For those of you interested in architecture, modernism in Zaporizhia, so it's more than a nuclear power plant. This is from Mykolaiv, another city that you've seen sort of on the Black Sea, encircled by Russians. And it's a major port city. And here we are at the summer school in Mykolaiv, meeting with the director of a former collective farm, and he's actually showing us some of the beautiful murals in this building. This is Kherson. You've seen something about Kherson on the news. It was captured by the Russians, but you saw images of Ukrainians waving the flags and defying the Russian occupiers. It's a beautiful city. In the south, this was a river cruise that we got to take in the summer school. This is the university. Summer schools in Ukraine always involve picking berries from trees. This is the Azov Sea, which is a beach area near Kherson, where we got to go. This is the summer school in Lviv, where actually Dr. Muller and I met. You can see her in this photograph on the left. We're sitting by sort of a local relaxation area and a lake. And on the right, you see our friend Sofia Diak with Boris Dorfman, who is one of the oldest Jews in Lviv. Actually, he came to Lviv in 1944 after the city was liberated from the Nazis. And he's been there ever since, advocating for Yiddish, for Jewish history and culture in the city. Again, all the many people, the restless women who have taught me about Ukraine. This is Oksana. She and I are doing a radio show. I honestly can't remember about what on the left. And here we are in the Carpathians on vacation with her daughter, Hanusia. Oksana has actually left her daughter and husband in Canada. They all now live in Canada, and she's returned to Ukraine to fight for her country. Ukraine is also Lehedzana. This is a village about 90 minutes from Kyiv. And these old women have preserved songs. They preserved Ukrainian songs throughout the Soviet period. And they're singing them here at this big birthday party, actually, for a local friend. And the party was organized by my friend Andriy, pictured here, who has joined the Ukrainian army last week. Ukraine is trains. Ukraine is a country that you can pop on a train anywhere and really get to anywhere else in the country. And so much of my time in Ukraine is on trains, drinking tea, as you can see pictured here, on a train journey from west to east or east to west. Ukraine is also cats. Over the past 17 years, I've had the pleasure and privilege of knowing many Ukrainian cats. And Ukraine is friends. Here is Sophia Diak, the very good friend, the restless woman, the friend of Dr. Muller and myself. This was last summer in the Carpathians when we never could have imagined what this year would bring. And these are the beautiful Carpathian Mountains. May they see peace again very soon. So those are some images. I hope they make Ukraine come alive just a little bit for you. I'm actually going to sort of move a little bit into boring history professor mode and tell you a little bit of history about Ukraine. So buckle your seatbelts and hopefully this won't be too boring. But I think it's important to know a little bit about the history, which of course didn't just start on February 24th, but has a long, rich tapestry behind it. So back in the day, the 10th century day, the city Kyiv, currently under attack, was the center of a polity called Kievan Rus, which was a loose confederation of princely states centered in Kyiv. And actually that Sofiyski Sobor, that Sophia's cathedral that I showed you where the archives are, that was one of the architectural gems of Kievan Rus. And at this point, Russia was a swamp. There was no Russia, right? But when the Mongols invaded in the 13th century, Kiev, like many places, didn't submit to Mongol rule and was destroyed. And it was then that the princes of a polity in the swamp called Muscovy made a deal with the Mongols and rose from the swamps to become the Russian Empire under Peter the Great in 1722. 1722 is when Peter the Great officially says, we are not just Russia, we are the Russian Empire. And so when I teach the Russian Empire, we sort of go from 1722 forwards. That's fine. But things were different down south in former Kievan Rus. And actually, this region that is today Ukraine was part of Poland, rather part of what was called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And you might think, wait, what, Poland, Lithuania? Like, what? Wasn't Europe just France? No, it wasn't, right? In the 16th to 18th centuries, Poland was a major player in Europe. And so this is actually a picture of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, which was founded in 1615 in Kiev. And at that point, Kiev was really the center of the Orthodox world, a big religious player, and sent many churchmen actually north to help Peter the Great with education and culture in Russia. And so in this area, in these Ukrainian lands that were then part of Poland, it means there was Polish language. It means there was the Counter-Reformation and the Baroque, if that means anything to you. It means there was a new church called the Greek Catholic Church, which was Orthodox who respected the primacy of the Pope in Rome. There were people called Cossacks who worked for the Ottoman Empire or the Poles, working the borderlands for whoever would pay them the most, living as free bands of men. This was an incredibly diverse place, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This was also where Jews lived in Eastern Europe, and often in the conflicts between Ukrainian peasants and Polish nobles, Jews were stuck in the middle. The Bogdan Khmelnytsky uprising, for example, in 1648, when Cossacks fought Poles, is also remembered as a devastating period in Jewish history. In 1654, the Cossacks sided with the Tsar, thinking he would respect their autonomy. This was a mistake. The Ukrainian lands at this point became divided. I'll show you a picture of Poland, Lithuania here. The Ukrainian lands became divided. So many Ukrainian lands remained part of Poland, right? And then there was sort of a rump state with some privileges under the Russian Empire, a state called the Hetmanate, simply because the ruler of the Cossacks was called the Hetman. And the Hetmanate existed until Catherine the Great fully brought the area under Russian imperial control. Catherine partitioned Poland, bringing a huge Jewish, Polish, and Ukrainian population into the Russian Empire. She made much of that population serfs. Serfdom is a complicated concept, but it means that she deprived them of freedom and tied them to the land. And she also caused religious warfare on the border between Greek Catholics, Orthodox, and Jews, of course, caught in the middle in a region that is, in a time that is also remembered, right, as a great period of Jewish violence, anti-Jewish violence. But still, interestingly, this is what one scholar calls the golden age of Jewish culture. Small towns throughout the region where Jews, Poles, and Ukrainians lived side by side, together and apart. In the 19th century, Ukrainian lands were part of the Vienna-ruled Habsburg Empire, which we can see here in the blue, Austria-Hungary, and the St. Petersburg-ruled Russian Empire, pictured here in the pink. As you know, in World War I, empires collapsed, right? And there were many political projects that came out of this collapse of empires after World War I. And I'll really just talk about two that sort of won out, right? One was Poland, right, which became a state again after Catherine's partitions, became a state again after the Treaty of Versailles in 1918, and Soviet Ukraine, which you can kind of see here. I'm sorry, this is in Ukrainian, but you can kind of see the outline here of the Ukrainian SSR, the Soviet Ukraine, which was one of the republics of the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. One of them was Soviet Ukraine. Poland was democratic, but became a quasi-military dictatorship in the 1930s with increasing anti-Semitism, anti-Ukrainianism. In Soviet Ukraine, interestingly, the state supported, promoted Ukrainian and Jewish culture with state-sponsored theaters, schools, books, publishing, etc. It was here in Soviet Ukraine that you had an extraordinary outpouring of experimental art. I actually wrote a book about this, right, that I've spoken about before that we were supposed to talk about today. You see here on the right, Les Kurbas, this amazing theater director, and on the left, Mykola Kulish, one of the most stunning Ukrainian playwrights ever. And they created many productions at the Berezil Theater in this period. On the left, we see a production called Diktatura, and on the right, a backstage photo from the first ever Ukrainian musical review called Hello from Frequency 477. But Soviet Ukraine was also part of the Soviet dictatorship, right? And there were many manifestations of Stalin's dictatorship, including the Holodomor, the terror famine of 1932-33, in which probably 4 million, and that's a low estimate, villagers died of hunger because Stalin raised grain collection levels to bend the breadbasket of Europe to his will. Yet life continued until 1939, when Hitler and Stalin made a pact and invaded Poland, right? So the USSR took this chunk of formerly Eastern Poland, right? And the Nazi Reich took this chunk of Western Poland. So Poland was divided. And people there at that time had the same decision that friends of Dr. Muller and I have had in the last few weeks. Do we stay? Do we go? And if we go, where do we go? In which direction? Ukraine was brutally occupied by the Nazis after Hitler invaded in June 1941. Babyn Yar in Kyiv, for example, was a site where on 2 days in September 1941, the Nazis shot over 33,000 Jews. And you may remember last week, there was quite a lot on the news because a TV tower in Kyiv near Babyn Yar was shot. And so some of that memorial complex was destroyed in a very symbolic act of destruction by the Russians. There were mass shootings in World War II in every town and village, the Holocaust by bullets, as the term is. Liberation began in 1943, but the question was, what state would rule these lands, right? I mean, the Soviet Union had invaded and taken Western Ukraine away from Poland. Would Poland get that land back or not? And because of, in a way, very similar geopolitical discussions to what we see today happening at Yalta and at Potsdam, in the big conferences that the Allies had to end the war, the Soviet Union and Soviet Ukraine got to keep that chunk of Poland, right? And so this city, Lviv, where we had the summer school, right, became not part of Poland. It was not given back to Poland, but it became part of Soviet Ukraine. And I've been thinking so much about that period, about people who survived the war and then didn't get their country back. And I think that one thing you can take away from the story of Ukraine is that in this region, people have lost their country so many times, right? And so many people that we know have had to leave Donetsk and Luhansk, right? Leave these sort of breakaway republics in 2014, move to Kiev, and just now have had to leave Kiev again to move west. But in 1991, Soviet Union collapsed and there was independent Ukraine. The majority, interestingly, of the USSR's weapons, nuclear weapons, were in Ukraine. And so the 1994 Budapest Memorandum urged Ukraine to denuclearize, right, to get rid of their nukes, which they did, right? And in exchange for Russia, the US, and the UK agreeing to support Ukrainian territorial integrity, right? You give up your nuclear weapons, we will respect your territorial integrity. And of course, that has not happened. It's a challenge to emerge from communism, right? Suddenly you have a market, suddenly you're supposed to have rule of law, not rule of men. There's no ideology. There was indeed a pro-Russian population in Ukraine, people who felt a greater sense of belonging to the Soviet past than the Ukrainian present. But Ukraine voted fairly transparently, democracy grew, there was a new parliament, courts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Revolutions in Ukraine continued to push Ukraine on the path of democracy, including the Orange Revolution in 2004, when blatant disregard of votes brought people out to protest in favor of getting rid of Russian-serving President Viktor Yanukovych in favor of Viktor Yushchenko. In 2010, in a twist of history, votes were again cast for Yanukovych, right? The guy who'd been ousted in the Orange Revolution was voted in again in 2010, but votes were cast, right? I mean, this was a functioning democracy. Until 2013, when young students, just like you, just like my students, got out to protest the president's statement that Ukraine would never join the EU. And those student protests led to what's called the Revolution of Dignity, or Maidan, or Euromaidan, when the center of Ukraine became the sort of amazing site of civil society. You can see an image here. This is a photo taken by my friend Yosef Savenki, whom you saw earlier. And finally, Yanukovych was ousted in 2014, and everybody thought, oh my gosh, like we won, the revolution was successful. Then Putin took Crimea. Then two small regions broke away from Kiev with Russian military and financial support, and war began in 2014 in Eastern Ukraine, and war has not stopped. So until February 24th, the number was that about 14,000 Ukrainian lives had been lost. Obviously, that number is higher today. And so here's some questions I often get, right? Are Ukrainians and Russians the same? No. The history that I've just told you is the history of Ukrainian lands. The history of Russia would be different. Many Ukrainians speak Russian, but that's not a big deal. It's largely a bilingual country. And it's a very 19th century concept that just because you speak a language somehow means you should be a part of that country, right? No, there's just a lot of Russian speaking Ukrainians. It's a civic nationality, not an ethnic nationality. And Russia and Ukraine are very different today. Ukraine is a democracy. It's a functioning democracy. People voted for the president, 73% of the vote, right? There's increasingly good institutions. It's a market-based culture. You can express yourself, you can protest. It's a free country without state oppression, unlike Russia. And right now, Ukraine is in a physical and existential battle for its existence, right? And I just hope that something in this presentation has resonated with you, some image, something I said, for you to always keep the Ukrainians front and center when you read coverage and when you read the story of the war in Ukraine. So I'll end by saying "Дякую за увагу," which is Ukrainian for "thank you for your attention." And I will stop sharing, and I would love to hear from all of you. I'm ready to answer any questions. And thank you so much for giving me so much of your attention this morning.
Mayhill, thank you so much. Дякую. So maybe I will start with a question and then we'll open the floor for questions. Those of you who are on Zoom, please type your questions in the chat box or just raise your hand if you would like to ask. Mayhill, how are your friends, our friends doing? What's the spirit there? I know that you're in touch with many people on the ground in different cities from Lviv, Kiev to Kharkiv. How are they feeling? What's going on there?
That's a great question, Dr. Muller. Thank you. I do think that the stories of everyday Ukrainians and their experiences need to be highlighted. And I think what has been emotional for me is the way that this violent invasion has affected everyone. I don't know anyone, and I know a lot of people in Ukraine who is unaffected and who is not traumatized. And I think that what I've learned from this is how quickly trauma happens, right? That one night of bombing, one night in a shelter, and the trauma is there and it's real. So Dr. Muller and I have friends who have walked to the border, right? They've gotten in a car to go to the border to protect their children, and the line's too long, so they get out and walk holding their child. We have friends who chose to remain in Kiev, chose to remain in Kharkiv until it was just too dangerous. I have a very good friend who stayed in Kharkiv until really the last moment. And finally he said, I just had to get my wife and my daughter out. The shooting was too much. And he said, I feel nothing but shame at the fact that I had to leave my city. I have colleagues in Lviv, which is in the West and currently unbombed, right, which is a refugee center now. And so friends who are translating, who are hooking people up, right? They hear of one person who has a seat in a car going to Poland and one person who needs that seat, so getting them together. People working on distribution of goods, distribution of humanitarian aid. Dr. Muller and I had a colleague Oksana, whom you just saw, who left Canada to come back to Ukraine, and she was in Warsaw getting medicine. And so could we hook up medicine and her so she could cross the border into Ukraine with those meds? And so people are engaged, they are active, they are doing what they can. Many people have joined the army, but no one is not touched. Diane, I'm going to answer your question. Diane asks, do you know or understand why Russia is so intent on taking Ukraine? How do the people of Ukraine understand this invasion? Like, what do they think is the reason why Russia won't just leave Ukraine alone? I know, natural resources, the spread of non-democratic ideals, etc. Yeah, so that's a really great question. And unfortunately, Diane, the answer partially lies in the very scary, honestly, speeches that Vladimir Putin has been giving for a while now. I mean, really starting with a speech he gave last summer that I have to say, including myself, we didn't take seriously enough, but where he really turned towards a very, I would say, 19th century Russian imperial expansionist idea about kind of expanding Slavdom. And I know that sounds kind of extreme, but I think that's what he was, that's what he means. And so taking Ukraine is not pragmatic, right? It's not about natural resources. It's not about really a security belt. It's really not about the West. It's about a sort of messianic imperial expansionist urge that fundamentally denies sovereignty to Ukraine, and that sort of wants to bring all these Slavic lands together. And I do think that Ukraine's increasing democracy, increasing Westernization is a threat, it is an existential threat to Russia, right? To Putin, rather. That if you have a functioning democracy where people vote and it matters, and courts work, that is a threat to the increasingly authoritarian Russian regime. So it's these two things, I think. One, this sort of messianic expansionist ideology, right? And also the threat of democracy in Ukraine. And that is how the people of Ukraine understand the invasion, right? That we were just living our lives. I have so many friends who posted, what just happened? I just went out, to a nice restaurant with a friend and we had a bottle of wine and a fancy salad. And then I woke up and Putin's bombing me, right? So this sort of, they understand it as this war of annihilation, right? That suddenly Russia just wants their country to be erased from the map, right? A question from Christina. Do you still think there might be a possible diplomatic solution into ending this conflict? If so, what are some of the things you believe might stop Russia? I don't think there is a diplomatic solution. I think Putin has shown very clearly he's not into diplomacy. This whole kind of diplomatic game that we in the West were playing seriously, right? People were meeting with Putin and calling him on the phone and talking, and we were doing diplomacy. And it turns out that that was all pretend for Putin. He was always going to invade, right? There was no diplomacy. And right now there's no diplomatic off-ramp for Putin. I think we need to take him at his word, which is that Ukraine does not exist, which is that it does not deserve to be a state. That's what he's about. So I don't actually think there's diplomacy possible, which is why, Diane, to your second question, yes, the people of Ukraine want on-the-ground military support from NATO allies. They want this sort of close the sky, the no-fly zone over Ukraine. And we very much understand the geopolitics of that, that as soon as you have NATO planes shooting down Russian planes, then all of a sudden you really do have World War III. But I also think that there are ways, and this is happening, right? There are ways to get more military support to the Ukrainians without involving kind of all of NATO. And I think people who make a lot more money than I do should be able to figure that out, right? Because there is no stopping Putin diplomatically. I think the way Putin is stopped is if he is, shall we say, out of the equation, or the Russian army is vanquished and conquered, right? And the Ukrainians are victorious. So I think we have to be realistic about there's not a diplomatic solution. So what can we do? And how can we increase military support to the Ukrainians? And that is what they want. And I would say one of the difficult things, the many difficult things about kind of being here while my friends are there is that all they want is military support. And so all I can say is, I'm so sorry. I love you so much. And I'm so sorry, because what they want is military support. And I can't give them that, right? And, I had a colleague say, if you guys just keep watching, you can close every Holocaust museum in the West, because you've clearly shown that never again is weak, right? And I think that we do need to think about our international organizations, right? And how can you have a functioning UN Security Council if the head of the Security Council is Russian and vetoes the votes, right? What is the point of the UN? What is the point of the UN, right? And so I think there are always these moments where we have international organizations and then something big happens and we realize, oh, right, the League of Nations in the interwar period didn't work very well, right? Now we have the UN. Oh, the UN doesn't seem to work very well, right? If we didn't know that earlier from the war in the former Yugoslavia. So I do think our international organizations need to step up. I do think we need to increase military support, and that is what Ukrainians want. So I hope that wasn't too extreme in my answers.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Super.
Awesome. I'm wondering if you can add Belarus to the picture in terms of talking about the relationship between Russia and Poland and Ukraine?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you. Yeah, so you guys may have seen all the protests last year in Belarus. Yeah, ringing a bell, sort of. Well, they were protests last year in Belarus, or I guess 2 years ago now. We're in 2022. I keep forgetting. Against Lukashenko, who is the dictator of Belarus and a very close ally of Putin's. And Lukashenko, with Putin's help, with Russian help, essentially shut down those protests. And today, yes, Belarus is sided with Russia against Ukraine. And in a way, it's no surprise because Lukashenko is a Putin ally, right? And he's very aware of his place in the geopolitical order. So Belarus is fighting against Ukraine, is contributing troops against Ukraine, and is itself a dictatorship. And so you're right to point out Belarus. You know, the other country region sending troops is Chechnya, right, which was bombed into submission by the Russians in the 90s, and has been sending fighters to fight for Russia against Ukraine. So yes, Russia's allies are Chechnya and Belarus, fighting against Ukraine, which definitely says something. We have some questions in the chat as well. Joe asks, do you see Putin stopping with the conquest of Ukraine? Joe, that's a great question. And I don't know. I mean, I think he's doing quite well, oddly. We talk a lot about, oh, the invasion stalled and who knew the Ukrainians were so resilient. It's true, but they're still there, right? And in the West, we're sort of, we don't know what to do. Do we give them arms, right? Our back is against the wall. Putin's back is not against the wall. And so is he going to stop? I don't know. I think were he to take all of Ukraine, God forbid, right? Why would he stop, right? Why wouldn't he get the Baltics back, right? Which are NATO countries, and then we would be in World War III. So, Joe, I don't know. I don't know. That is the honest answer. Mackenzie asks, what do you think of the foreign volunteers heading to Ukraine? That's also a great question, Mackenzie. I'll just tell you, I actually downloaded the application for the International Legion myself. My partner said probably my talents would be better served doing other things, like giving talks about Ukraine and not necessarily going over to fight. But I do think that there was an op-ed I read over the weekend, and I can't remember where, that said, you know, in the last 20 years, there's a way that we become complacent, and are we up to this new battle against totalitarianism? Right? The world was, you know, mobilized against fascism. Are we mobilized against Putinism and Putin in China, really, right? Against sort of 21st century authoritarianism. How mobilized are we? And in sort of the interviews that you've read with these foreigners going to Ukraine, I mean, that's sort of what they say, right? I mean, probably some people just like a fight, right? But some people are like, no, this is it. Like, I gotta step in there. I gotta step up. I have some skills, and this is where we fight dictatorship, right? So I think it's good, actually. Let's see. Do you think Russia has the resources to stand alone if the NATO allies and all Western allied countries completely cut off Russia economically and or otherwise? That's also a great question, Diane. I do think they have the resources to stand alone as Russia, for sure. They do have a lot of resources. They have an internal banking system, even though Visa and MasterCard have cut them off. But yeah, the ruble is in free fall. They are cut off from Facebook and Twitter, which are the heart of our lives, right? But cut off from news, cut off from family members abroad, right? You know, we have some Russian students at my school who are cut off from family, and, you know, will they be able to pay their tuition, right? Probably not. And that's a very scary situation for these students. So I think Russia as a pariah state is also scary for the world, and certainly scary for Russians. And yet, yes, Russia is an authoritarian regime, clearly a violent, aggressive one, and does need to be stopped. And so kind of how do we do that with the means at our disposal? We're figuring that out, right? What do you think of China's influence on Russia, asks Joe. I read some stuff online that says if China pulled its support for Russia, it could be the key to ending this war or any escalation of it. I think that's also a really great question. I think China's been very interesting to watch, right? Because it is a severe authoritarian regime, right? Massive human rights violations. In the region with Russia, right? I mean, that Russia-China relationship is very important to China, right? Having that connection with Russia. And yet, of course, Russia's increasing economic isolation is also a threat to China, right? And so I think that is something to watch. Again, I can't predict what that's going to happen, but I think certainly looking at that Russia-China connection is something to kind of pay attention to. Absolutely, absolutely. Any other questions? You guys are asking great questions, by the way, like super engaged and just exactly the right things that you should be asking.
Okay, here we have a question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Do you think that this might sound stupid, but do you think that they were able to evacuate do you think the Ukrainians were able to like evacuate to somewhere like outside of the like Ukraine Russian regime to like England or France or the US or Canada to help like be safer?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Yes, there's a lot of evacuation happening for sure. We hear a lot about Poland and Romania, right? CNN is in Poland, right, interviewing the refugees. But actually, there are a lot of initiatives to bring Ukrainians to other countries, to the United States, to Canada, to Great Britain. There's a lot of networks of universities that Dr. Muller and I are very connected with. So Scholars at Risk, right? So Yale University opening up some fellowships for Ukrainian scholars, right, to come to safety. Universities in Canada, right, creating opportunities for Ukrainian students to come to evacuate, right, to be safe. I think one of the challenging issues is that people don't want to leave, right? What does it mean to leave? What is that choice? I think that choice is very difficult for people, right? Should they stay, right? Should they be close in Poland, right? Where they could maybe get back to their parents, maybe get back to a family member, maybe get back to fight, right? What does it mean to go all the way to the United States or Canada? I think those are really complicated, personal, intense, emotional questions that people are facing right now. And of course, you know, I think there's this other issue of the logistics of being a refugee, right? If you notice, there was recently, you know, originally when Ukrainians were going into Poland, it was like, you just got a few weeks, right? You know, and now it's 3 years, right? You can be there for 3 years, right? But if you think about it, you know, what does it mean to leave your country and go to another country and start over? What if you don't speak the language? How do you get a job, right? These are all things that, you know, some of you may have your own family stories, right, of leaving a home country and coming to another country. And I think that's something that these people are dealing with right now. And those stories will come out, right? Those stories absolutely will come out. People will be writing about this, right, for a long time. We have some other questions in the chat. Let's see. Diane is asking, do you think the US has the power to end this altogether as a standalone power or as the head of the NATO allies? No, I don't. I actually think, this is, in many ways, this is a European war right now. And so, like, who could really help right now? Poland, Germany, right? And one of the interesting questions is, right, like, there's a way that being in NATO kind of ties you down, right? Like, I think Poland, Poland's like, oh my God, like Russia's right there, right? Poland has historically, as Dr. Muller knows, right, always been invaded by Russia, right? And certainly doesn't want that to happen again. So what is Poland thinking, right? In a way, how can Poland help without, bringing in all of NATO? But the stakes for Poland are extremely high, right? And so I don't think it's just up to the US to end this. I actually think it's European powers, right? Being able to step in and do what they can. Diane is also asking, do you think the elimination, in quotes, of Putin specifically would actually end this war and create democracy in Russia to prevent future conflicts? Or is this ultimate Russian supremacy an inherent Russian governmental mindset, as we've seen throughout history? It's also a great question. So Russia watchers, right, political scientists say who work on Russia, say regime change would be catastrophic, right? That Russia's never been able to do regime change well, it's true. And, we don't know what would be after Putin. And so, be very wary of talking about the elimination of Putin because incredible chaos could engulf this country. And I think what we've seen in the post-Soviet and post-socialist period is how hard it is to build democracy. Democracy takes work, it takes engagement, it takes sacrifice. It's very difficult. And so even ending the war, let's say when the war ends, right, Russia will not automatically be a democracy. And you're right, Diane, it never has been. So what will it take to get it moving on that path? I don't know, right? But I will say, Ukraine was a Soviet socialist republic. It was super Soviet in everything that means, right? Corrupt, police state, et cetera, et cetera. And guess what, right? In a couple decades, and it took a couple decades, but they were a functioning democracy. They got there. So it can be done, right? Obviously, it can't be done under an authoritarian dictator. And I do think, in a way, we're waking up in the West to the degree of authoritarianness that Putin is, right? But democracy in Russia, like I don't know. That's not my call to make, and it will take a lot of work for sure. Jasmine asks, do you think Ukraine will ever have a chance to get into NATO or the EU, or will they not allow Ukraine in on behalf of Putin's threats? Jasmine, that's a great question. I think they are moving closer to EU and NATO membership, like literally every second. Whether that happens and when that happens, you're exactly right. There's a complicated geopolitical game. And Jasmine, I would say that I am so glad I'm not in politics right now. I'm so glad I'm a historian. I'm so glad I study people. I'm so glad I study stories. I'm so glad I study on the ground, because those kinds of conversations that Jasmine's question invites are conversations I don't ever want to have, right? I don't ever want to say like, well, we can't allow Ukraine in the EU because it might, push Putin against the wall, and then what's going to happen? To me, Ukraine is a country of people, right? And stories and their lives. And I can't sort of throw them under the geopolitical bus. So I'm very glad I'm not working in the White House right now. It's a very good question, Jasmine. Christina asks, from what I've seen on the news this morning, the White House is set to announce a massive ban, yeah, I saw that too, on Russian gas, oil, and coal today. How do you believe Putin will react to this, and will it make any difference? Christina, that's a very good question. I don't know. I mean, part of me thinks this is what he was expecting. I mean, when you're engaged in a war of annihilation, you sort of expect the stakes are high and you expect that everyone's going to be extreme. Right. And he's already being extreme, right? He's already bombing cities and bombing civilians. So I don't know. I don't know. I also think there's, Putin's fine, right? He's got his own money. His country will suffer, but he doesn't care about his country, right? He doesn't care about doing good governance for the Russian people, right? And so I think the question might be, the White House is set to announce a massive ban on Russian gas, oil, and coal. How will the Russian people react to that, right? And that's something to think about, right? How that will affect Russians, everyday Russians, and what we'll see from them, right? Again, hard with the ban on news, right? And social media outlets. If Joe asks, if Putin gets desperate enough to use nuclear force against Ukraine, oh my goodness, Joe, do you think the rest of the world would have to get involved? Yes. I mean, if there's a nuclear incident, absolutely, it's world war. I think that's, even if it hasn't attacked anyone outside of Ukraine. Yeah, no, it's a legit question, but I think the issue with nuclear weapons, as we know, is that the cloud never doesn't respect borders, right? Any nuclear incident is gonna spread and gonna go larger, right? So that will raise the stakes, as they say. And Diane, do you can Russia win against the world? Do you think the Russian people could overthrow Putin should they decide to massively mobilize? Yeah, Diane, I don't know. As we've seen in Russia, right? The Tsar was overthrown. I mean, actually, it was generals who convinced him to abdicate, and then his brother didn't take the job. So, and then the Bolshevik coup, but then there was a 4-year civil war. So, they do the overthrow thing, right? So, we'll have to see about the Russian people. I think for me, the way I think about it is, can the Ukrainian people win? And I think they can. I absolutely think they can, right? As we say in sports, they have home court advantage, right? But they are being invaded, and they are, over 8 years of war, they have learned to fight for their country, to mobilize. They have the logistics networks, they have the patriotism, they have the spirit of sacrifice. And I think they will win, right? And then we'll see what happens to the global order.
Can I, Dr. Fowler, can I interfere? We have
Yes,
a couple
sorry.
of minutes. We have a couple
Yes.
of minutes left, and there's a lot of questions about geopolitics, and clearly we have a lot of questions and very little answers. I would like to sort of shift this conversation somewhere else and maybe ask the last question.
Super.
What can we do? What can American
Great.
students do?
Absolutely. So there's a lot that you can do. First of all, just by coming to class today, you've done something. You've educated yourself about Ukraine. I guarantee you, next time you watch a news thing on Ukraine, you're going to be like, oh, that's like what that professor was saying, or like, that reminds me of that image that professor showed. Like, literally, by coming to class and educating yourself on this conflict, on this war, on what is happening, you're doing something. You can also donate if you feel moved or you have the means to do so. There are some organizations, and I'm happy to send Dr. Muller a list of sort of respected organizations that do humanitarian aid. There are a couple that are US based, and so very easy to donate to, right? No sort of complicated bank transfers, but very easy to donate to, that have been operating since 2014 when the war started, and are very good at humanitarian aid, getting resources to Ukrainians on the ground as swiftly and effectively as possible. You can also donate to the Ukrainian army if you feel so moved. And I think continuing to spread the focus on Ukraine, stand with Ukraine, versus just focusing on Russia. I think that kind of shift mentally is one that ultimately perhaps will have greater political resonance. That's my answer.
Thank you. I think we can end here. Thank you so much. I know it was a lot for you to talk for over an hour and talk about.
I'm so sorry. I talked so much. I'm so sorry.
No, we wanted you to talk. It's just that I know how emotionally and also physically exhausting this is. We're all exhausted from just last almost over 10 days now, right? Almost 2 weeks. Thank you so much. Our hearts go to you and our Ukrainian friends and Ukraine. And thank you so much for coming. We did record it, so I will try to post it and maybe we can share it somewhere on social media, because I think, again, it's very important to realize what a wonderful country Ukraine is.
Yes.
That this is a vicious and unprecedented, maybe not unprecedented, but uncalled for attack. And we need to do whatever we can to spread the word about Ukraine and maybe talk less about Russia and more about Ukraine. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Muller. Thank you.